expulsion or extraction from its mother of an embryo or fetus weighing 500 gram or less, and when it is not capable of independent survival. That is the WHO definition of abortion. So this 500 gram of fetal development is attained approximately at 20 to 22 weeks of gestation. The incidence of spontaneous abortion, that means pregnancy terminating on its own, is about 10 to 20% of all the clinical pregnancies, and they end up in miscarriage. So another name for abortion is miscarriage. Nowadays, we don't use the terminology as abortion because it's quite crude in the sense, it's very insensitive. So we use the terminology as miscarriage whenever we are trying to explain to the patient or the attendants. Miscarriage is a better terminology than the abortion. Right. So as you can see, the incidence is quite high. 10 to 20% of the clinical pregnancies end in miscarriages, especially as I discuss in the subsequent line, 75% abortions occur before 16th week of pregnancy, and out of those, 75% occur even before, that is 8th week of pregnancy. So from this, what you understand is that almost 75% of the abortions occur in the first trimester. Okay, so the second trimester abortions or miscarriages are quite less in the incidence. They constitute about 25% of the abortions. So as you remember, the incidence is quite high. So if you're seeing about 100 clinical pregnancies, out of that, almost 10 to 20 will end up in spontaneous abortion, sometimes until 16th week. So that's why you need to be vigilant, and any complaints the patient is coming up to you, you need to always be vigilant and explain to her about the process of abortion as well. So this is a brief about abortion, the definition as well as the incidences. So before I actually go to the types of abortions and all that, I want you to understand what are the various stages in the early pregnancy, and how you will correlate on the ultrasonography. Okay, see, when you correlate the gestational age with the ultrasound, when the pregnancy is about 4 weeks, what will you be able to see is just an endometrial thickening. So in this figure, you can see the uterus here. Okay, this whole thing is the uterus, and this is the white line. What you can see here, it is actually the endometrial cavity. So this is the endometrial cavity with this white line, and you can see another shaded a little hyperechoic and a mixed echogenic area here. This is nothing but the endometrium, and this endometrium is quite thick in the sense it is occupying whole of the you can see the uterine cavity as well. So this is the myometrium, this is the endometrium. It is very small cavity lining here, and you can just see a thickened endometrium at around 4 weeks of pregnancy. Next week, that is in about 5 weeks, you can appreciate a gestational sac. So this is the uterus. You can see the uterus, and this is the gestational sac. So the sac is visible very easily because it contains the amniotic fluid as early as formation of the gestational sac, and this fluid will demarcate as it's a dark area. So this sac is very easily appreciated in the uterine cavity as a small dark area. So by 5 weeks, you should be able to see the gestational sac. What I'm explaining to you is all the normal events in pregnancy, so that you can understand them better and then identify what is abnormal. So 4 weeks, it's just an endometrial thickening here, and you are hardly is able to see any sac at this age. But by 5 weeks, you should be able to see the gestational sac as it is seen here. Remember, all these milestones or the scans are on transvaginal examination. So always transvaginal examination, a transvaginal ultrasonography. Just a moment, I think I'll see if anybody wants to get admitted. Sir is there to do that. Sir, did you start the recording? I forgot to start the recording actually.
I have started.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. Fine. So we'll continue with the class. So as you can see, these are all transvaginal sonographies, and the appreciation of very early pregnancy changes is much better with the transvaginal sonography. So between 5.5 to 6 weeks, an yolk sac, that is a small ring, white ring-like thing, appears within the gestational sac. So this is an important event again, the appearance of the yolk sac on the ultrasonography. Then subsequently between 5.5 to 6.5 weeks, it's an average, you can see a fetal pole also developing within the yolk sac, and you can see the small fetal pole is here. So you can see the gestation sac, the yolk sac, and then you can see a small fetal pole developing. By about 5.5 to 6.5 weeks, you should be able to appreciate a fetal pole. The fetal pole will be appearing like a hyperechoic area, and as and when the fetus grows, you can even see small limb-birds appearing by about 6 to 7 weeks, and there will be embryonic movements in the real-time ultrasonography, and by 6.5 to 7 weeks, you should be able to appreciate the heartbeat within the fetal shadow or the fetal pole. Right. So here again, you can clearly see the gestation sac, the fetal pole, as well as the yolk sac. So these are the normal milestones or the normal findings on the ultrasonography. According to the weeks of the gestation, you should be able to appreciate. Now, once you have understood these, normal milestones on the ultrasonography, let us now understand what are the abnormal early pregnancy changes that are associated with, of course, the abortion. There is one terminology called as blighted ova. Now, what happens is blighted ova here, this is again a kind of an abortion or an early pregnancy loss in which the fetal development is not at all observed with ultrasound. Only the gestation sac is present and the yolk sac may or may not be present. And here the fetal tissue is absent even on histological examination of the products of conception. So this kind of abnormal development where only the gestation sac develops and the yolk sac may or may not develop, but the fetal pole or the fetal tissue is definitely not there. So this kind of a abnormal development of the pregnancy is called blighted ova. Now, how do you diagnose that it's a blighted ova? Always we don't diagnose blighted ova just with the first sonography. For example, if the patient is coming to you in 5th week of gestational sac, and you can see only the empty gestation sac. But if the patient is coming to you at around 7 weeks, okay, so as you all know, that by 7 weeks or 6 to 7 weeks, between 6 to 7 weeks, she should have a fetal pole. Okay, so she should have a fetal pole. And according to LMP, if the patient is in 6 to 7 weeks gestation and still you can see only an empty gestational sac or with a yolk sac, then it shows that there is some abnormality. Okay, the patient, if she's asymptomatic, in the sense there is no signs of immediate, termination of the pregnancy with respect to either bleeding or pain or anything, and you're only finding at 6 to 7 weeks gestation is that only the gestational sac is present, straight away we don't label it as a blighted ovum. What we have to do in that case is we repeat the scan after a span of at least 1 week. So we call the patient back and repeat the ultrasonography. So within a span of 1 week, normally, even if there is a late conception, if the patient is in her 6th or 7th week, so after 1 week when you examine, the fetal pole should have developed. Okay, and still if the fetal pole does not develop in spite of waiting for a 1 week and repeating the scan, you can just see still the gestation sac, and or if the patient is having symptoms during that time like bleeding, pain abdomen, or she's already in inevitable kind of an abortion, that is the time when we diagnose or label it as a blighted ova. So remember, blighted ova is just not one-time diagnosis, in the sense if the patient history is like 7 weeks, we have to confirm that there is no development after a repeat scan, at least after 1 week. Okay, so this is called as blighted ova. Now next is early fetal demise. So what happens in early fetal demise or miscarriage, what we call, is the early pregnancy loss is in which the fetal development is clearly observed by ultrasound, and then the fetal tissue is found on the histologic examination. So what you have to understand, the important difference between blighted ova and early fetal demise is that in blighted ova, as we discussed, there is no fetal tissue. In early fetal demise, there has been an evidence of the fetal tissue by observing a fetal pole on the ultrasonography. Subsequently, the fetus does not develop. When you do a subsequent scans, the fetus does not develop, or it might result in a static development with the loss of the cardiac activity. So this we terminate, we put the name as early fetal demise, right? So I hope you all have understood the difference between what is blighted ova and early fetal demise, because it is important in terms of analyzing the causes or the etiology of the abortions, right? So the lack of development of the fetal structures defines a subset of abortions of genetic origin. Mostly, the blighted ova results from a genetic origin. In contrast, the early interruption of fetal life is a complex phenomenon with multiple etiologies. So therefore, the patients with blighted ova do not require extensive workup. Most of the times we end up having blighted ova, we tell the patient that it is some aberrant genetic problem or a congenital problem, so it usually does not recur. So we just reassure and send them back saying that, you know, there are less chances of recurrence in such cases. Whereas in patients who have had an early fetal demise, as we discussed, there are multiple causes for such a problem. The patients who have aborted cytogenetically normal fetuses need an extensive search for the non-genetic factors responsible for the pregnancy loss. So that is the primary difference between blighted ova and early fetal demise. We have to differentiate not only for the management but also for subsequent analysis, analyzing what was the cause for the miscarriage, and, you know, to take some precautions in the future pregnancies. So that's what is the importance between these two terminologies. So how does a blighted ovum look in case of an ultrasonography? As you can see here, there is just a gestational sac. You can see the yolk sac here, which is almost occupying, you know, the half of the gestational sac, and there is no fetal pole at all in any of the areas in the gestational sac. Also, another observation what you can make, this is in one section and this is probably in the transverse section. It's the same image. Sorry, it's the same case. Here what you can see, the gestational sac is irregular. Okay, so normally the gestational sac has to be round and it has to be regular. Either it is, most of the times it is oval, it has to be round. So in case the gestational sac, the wall of the gestational sac is irregular, as you can see here, it's like inundating in and out. So this is again an observation to be made, showing that there is an abnormal gestational sac. So in blighted ovum, as you can see, there's only gestational sac and the yolk sac. There is no fetal pole. Okay. And then how do you diagnose early fetal demise? You can see here in this ultrasound picture, you can see the gestational sac, the fetal pole is seen, right? So when you're seeing the fetal pole and when you measure the CRL, that is the age, gestational age is measured by taking the CRL, that is a crown rump length. And the crown rump length is corresponding to 6 or 7 weeks of the gestation. And at that time, you should be able to locate the cardia of the fetus. And then this is in the motion picture where we draw a line along the cardia of the fetus so that, you know, the vibrations can be appreciated, and the M mode is on in the ultrasonography. It should actually show a graph here on the M mode. Okay, so in this case, you can see when you want to document an early fetal demise, it is very important to get this picture on the ultrasonography, and you have to, you know, provide it to the patient for the confirmation. So where you locate the cardia, and in spite of, you know, adjusting, you're unable to get any graph on the M mode. So this shows that the baby's heartbeat is absent and indicates an early fetal demise. So what the important observation you have to make is the gestational sac is there and the fetal pole should be there, and the cardia should be absent to diagnose that it is a early fetal demise. So is it clear to all of you? You have understood well what is blighted ovum, what is early fetal demise or miscarriage? Students, are you there with me? If you don't respond, I feel like it's a one way, and whether there is
Yes,
a.
madam.
Yes,
They are
ma'am,
giving
we
in the chat box.
understand.
They are
Sorry?
answering in chat box, madam. They are answering in chat box. You can
Okay,
just see
okay.
them.
I
Yes, madam.
cannot see the chat box, students, because I'll be concentrating on the, you know, one window with my PPT. So please answer me back so that I feel that I'm there with you and there is no technical problem. Okay.
Yes, ma'am, we are understood, ma'am. Yes,
Fine,
ma'am.
we'll proceed next. See, another entity in the abortion is recurrent abortion. Recurrent abortion means there are multiple abortions back to back. Okay, so in recurrent abortion, earlier they used to consider recurrent abortion as 3 or more consecutive spontaneous abortions before 20 weeks. But nowadays we don't wait for the third abortion to occur. Okay, if there are 2 or more consecutive spontaneous abortions, we have to start evaluating as to what is the cause of these abortions with the patients, and then we need to find if there's any etiology and try to avoid it in the subsequent third pregnancy. So recurrent abortion, the theoretical definition is whenever there is a 3 or more consecutive spontaneous abortions before 20 weeks. But nowadays we don't wait until the third abortion to occur. If at all the patient is coming to you properly and she's following up with you, if she has had 2 spontaneous abortions back to back, we start evaluating and finding out what is the cause for the problem. So this is one important thing you have to remember. Now, what are the causes of abortion or the spontaneous abortion? There may be fetal and maternal causes. Fetal causes, most commonly, it is related to genetic aberrations in the fetus. So, chromosomal abnormalities, hydropic degeneration of the villi, as you can see in Rh negative pregnancies, and multiple pregnancy. So, multiple pregnancy also has a higher incidence of, again, chromosomal abnormalities. So, that's why we can predict that multiple pregnancy is a fetal factor and is maybe responsible for the abortion. So, these are the fetal factors. In the maternal causes, torch infections, malaria, ureaplasma, chlamydia, brucella, spirochetes. These are the common infections which would result in abortion. The medical disorders in the mother, especially hypertension, chronic renal diseases, cyanotic heart diseases, hemoglobinopathies, even diabetes and other causes, hypothyroidism sometimes, have been implicated in the medical causes, maternal causes for abortion. Environmental factors which affect include chronic alcohol abuse, high dose of caffeine, even smoking sometimes has been implemented as a cause. Exposure to radiation of more than 5 rads and even anesthetic gases, chronic exposure of anesthetic gases has also been found to be associated with certain abortions. Now, other endocrine problems associated with the abortions, and you should remember here that the endocrine problems are the most common cause of second trimester abortions, actually, and the congenital, the congenital or the chromosomal abnormalities form the most common cause of the first trimester abortions. So here in the endocrinological problems, the conditions could be luteal phase defect, that is deficiency of the progesterone in the second half of the cycle, in the conception cycle. If there is a deficiency of the progesterone, then there is abnormal development of the early pregnancy, and that would result in abortion sometimes. So that we call it as luteal phase defect. Thyroid abnormalities, especially hypothyroidism, does implicate in abortion. Poorly controlled diabetes mellitus, PCOD. Okay, so these are, again, PCOD is also it is an endocrine problem. It's also called as metabolic syndrome, where it is associated with factors like insulin resistance or even hyperandrogenism. So these endocrinological or hormonal factors will affect the development of the early fetus, and there is an increased incidence of abortions in such patients as well. So another thing what you have to remember, in patients with PCOD, they also have problems in conception because of low ovarian reserve, but they also have higher incidence of abortion also. So the endocrine problems are very common, and whenever we are evaluating for the abortions, we have to get all these tests done, especially the thyroid function tests, the blood sugar levels, even up to evaluating up to GTT has to be done for some patients with recurrent abortions, and any problems with the PCOS also need to be diagnosed. So this is very important, category for causes of abortion. Now, immunological causes, there are two important things. One is the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. This has been studied extensively now, and there has been a lot of evidence about this syndrome causing multiple problems, not only abortions, and we'll study this in detail. So remember, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome and inherited thrombophilias are associated with miscarriages. So, what are the other anatomical causes or the uterine causes mainly for the abortion? They include cervical incompetence, Mullerian anomalies, which the most common anomaly here you remember is actually the biconjugate uterus, but the most common problem or the most common Mullerian anomaly which will lead to abortions is actually septate uterus. Okay, in biconjugate uterus, abortion rate is there, but then there are so many instances where we have seen that the pregnancy grows up and it even has patient ends up growing up till term pregnancy. But if there is a septate uterus, the chances of abortion are very high. So remember, Mullerian anomalies, cervical incompetence, large and multiple submucous leiomyomas, Asherman syndrome, and DS exposure in utero are very, of course, nowadays we don't find any of such patients living. So DS exposure in utero is mainly a theoretical option. Asherman syndrome could be there, where Asherman syndrome, what happens in this problem is that the uterus, in the intrauterine cavity, there will be a lot of adhesions and bands forming within the uterine cavity, and the uterine cavity is obliterated, the walls of the uterus are almost approximated and fibrosed with each other. So that is Asherman syndrome, and most common causes for Asherman syndrome is multiple DNCs occurring in the patient or any trauma to the endometrium, which leads to fibrosis and obliteration of the uterine cavity. That is called as Asherman syndrome. So other causes which could lead to abortion is trauma, subchorionic hematoma. So these are the major causes. Now another, this slide will give you an insight as to remember certain points for you to, answer any of the MCQs. Right. So amongst the causes, whatever we have studied now, let us note and remember these points. Right. So what is the most common cause of spontaneous abortion? It is chromosomal abnormality or genetic factor or defective germplasm. What is most common chromosomal abnormality causing spontaneous abortion? It is autosomal trisomy. Okay. Trisomies have been identified in abortuses for all except chromosome number 1, and those with 13, 16, 18, 21, and 22 are most common. Most common specific chromosomal anomaly associated with abortions is monosomy X, that is in 20% of the cases, and trisomy 16 in 16% of the cases. Most common cause of first trimester recurrent abortion is chromosomal abnormality, mainly balanced translocation of the chromosomes. Most common cause of second trimester recurrent abortions, or overall most common cause of recurrent abortion, is cervical incompetence. Infections do not lead to recurrent abortions. So remember the maternal infections, what we studied, there could be torch infections, or the list was here. The torch infections or malaria, uroplasma, chlamydia, brucella, spirochetes, they all cause sporadic abortions. They usually do not cause recurrent abortions. So remember that the infections do not cause the recurrent abortions, right? So yeah, this was a slide to remember all the most common problems, so that it's easier for you to remember these things, and you can answer the options well when you have questions on these. So investigative measures useful in the evaluation of recurrent or early pregnancy loss. Parental peripheral blood karyotyping with banding technique when you're suspecting a chromosomal recurrent problem. So it's important to evaluate the parental with the parents with the karyotyping. Assessment of the intrauterine cavity with either office hysteroscopy or a hysterosalpingography. Thyroid function test, serum prolactin levels, anti-cardiolipin antibody, and lupus anticoagulant testing, that is APTT or PTINR, what we do, or the Russell Viper Genome testing. This particular test is done to evaluate the presence of the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So in the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, the most common antibodies which are found are the anti-cardiolipin antibodies, what we call it as ACA, and the lupus anticoagulant or the LAC. Okay, so these two are the most common antibodies found in that condition, and we do the testing for these particular antibodies to diagnose if the patient is having a antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Complete blood counts with platelet count, thrombophilia testing, especially if there is a history of thromboembolism in the patient in the past or in the family, then we go ahead with thrombophilia testing. Factor V Leiden, prothrombin gene mutation, and even protein S activity can be tested in such cases. Serum homocysteine levels are also suspected in patients having thromboembolism. Protein C and antithrombin activity is also to be tested in such patients. So remember, hyperhomocystinemia is one condition which is associated with some thrombotic anomalies, and hyperhomocystinemia is associated with abortion. So that's why testing for the serum homocysteine levels and subsequently testing for any of these genetic thrombotic problems like protein C deficiency or antithrombin activity have to be done in these patients. Now, according to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecology, they recognize only two types of tests as having clear value in the investigation of recurrent miscarriages. They do not believe in any other causes to be evaluated. They just test for the parental cytogenetic analysis, that is to rule out any chromosomal causes or the genetic causes for the recurrent abortion, as the lupus anticoagulant and anticardiolipin antibodies to rule out if the patient is having an antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So they believe that these two are the most important causes for recurrent abortions, and whenever there is a patient with recurrent miscarriages, they just end up doing these two evaluations rather than going back with all the other investigations. Now, another important thing is karyotype of parents is more important in recurrent pregnancy loss, whereas karyotype of the conceptus is more important in the first trimester abortion. So this will give us an idea as to what would be the cause in case of recurrent abortions or in case of first trimester abortions. So let us now discuss about the types of the abortion. See, as we discuss this, it is important to differentiate clinically what type of abortion it is. So whenever a patient is coming to you with the complaints of different kinds, so it is important for us to diagnose as to what kind of abortion it is and accordingly manage clinically. So the clinical types of abortion, there are 5 types, as you can see here. Threatened abortion, inevitable abortion, complete abortion, incomplete abortion, and missed abortion. The name itself will suggest what is exactly the problem, okay, in these cases. So in threatened abortion, what happens is it is a clinical entity where the process of abortion has started but has not progressed to a state from which the recovery is impossible. In the sense, you can still manage threatened abortion, and with good support and treatment, it can be halted and the pregnancy can continue. Okay, so that is threatened abortion. Inevitable abortion. Inevitable, the English meaning, as you all know, it cannot be avoided. So inevitable abortion is a clinical entity where the process of abortion has progressed to such a state that we further cannot continue the pregnancy. That is impossible to continue, and it will eventually result in the abortion. So that is inevitable abortion. Complete abortion is where the abortion process has started and it is ended with the complete expulsion of all the products of conception, or en masse, all of the products of conception are expelled. So that results in a complete abortion where there are no more retained products of conception left within the uterine cavity. So this is complete abortion. Incomplete abortion is where the entire products of conception are not expelled and a part is left inside the uterine cavity. That is incomplete abortion. Missed abortion is a condition where the fetus is dead and it is retained inside the uterus for a variable period. So where here the process of abortion in the sense has resulted in the death of the fetus, but clinically it is not in the state, it has not begun in in the or resulted in the dilatation of the cervix or bleeding or anything. So it is just diagnosed on ultrasound where the fetus is dead and it is still retained within the uterine cavity without any process or signs of abortion. So these are the different clinical types of abortions. So how will we be able to diagnose on clinical and ultrasonography findings each one of these conditions we will discuss subsequently. Is it clear to all of you students? All these 5 types of clinical
Yes, ma'am.
situations or
Yes,
clinical
ma'am.
types of abortion? Okay, so there's no doubt in this, right?
No, ma'am.
So here in this table, we can find out with the help of the clinical picture and ultrasonography what kind of abortion it is. Okay, so in threatened abortion, what happens is the patient will come to you with a complaint of slight bleeding, either in the form of spotting, and most of the times the bleeding here will be bright red. Remember, it's a fresh bleeding, so it will be bright red and it will be very scanty bleeding, very slight bleeding. What happens to the uterus size here? It will correspond to the size of the gestation. In the sense, if the patient is coming to you with 6 to 8 weeks of gestation, the uterine size also will be same size. Okay, it is not lesser or more. So the uterine size corresponds here because the pregnancy is still live. The growth of the pregnancy is still live and it will be developing according to her gestational age. So that's why the uterine size will be corresponding to the gestational age in threatened abortion. In another important finding, when you do a pervaginal examination in such patient, the os will be closed. Nowadays, because of the threatened abortion, PV we avoid so that we do not incite further damage in such cases because of the pressure, and we assess whether the internal os is closed or open on the ultrasonography itself. So anyways, we have to do the ultrasound to confirm what kind of the problem it is. And in that case, we avoid doing the PV. And straight away, when we do an ultrasonography, we will be able to see that the fetus is still live, the heartbeat is still there. And the cause for this threatened abortion could be it could also be picked up on the ultrasonography. Most of the times it is caused by a subchorionic hemorrhage. Subchorionic hemorrhage, where the chorion separates from the residua basalis, and a small hemorrhage or a bleed can be seen on the ultrasonography. We'll just discuss about this in the subsequent pictures I have collected. So this is how the clinical scenario is there in case of threatened abortion. Remember, on ultrasonographic examination, the internal os also is closed. So this is the threatened abortion. Now, what happens is inevitable abortion. The patient presents with a moderate to heavy bleeding. She is having abdominal pain. Sometimes, because of the heavy bleeding and the severe pain, the patient might also present to you in shock. And in that case, the size of the uterus could be equal to the size of the gestational age, or it could be less because the patient is the pregnancy has not grown for a period of time and it is ending up in inevitable abortion. Here, important thing is the os is open. Okay, the os is open with products of conception felt, and on ultrasonography, the fetus is dead, or the products of conception can be seen lying within the lower uterine segment, the os being open. You can see clearly that the products of conception have been displaced on the lower side and the os is open or the funneled. So these are the features on ultrasonography. So this will give you a picture that you cannot further prevent the abortion. It has to be terminated, accelerated, and it has to be terminated. So this is about inevitable abortion. Now, what is incomplete abortion? Here, how the patient presents to you is she has bleeding. There is a irregular bleeding in incomplete abortion, and there is a prolonged bleeding. So the patient gives history of amenorrhea of about 1.5 months or 2 months. Followed by that, she has been bleeding, and she bleeds for a longer period of time, like maybe 1 or 2 weeks also. And most of the time she doesn't realize, or she has kind of neglected. She comes with a irregular bleeding for 1 or 2 weeks. Sometimes the patient will come with a severe bout of bleeding as well in incomplete abortion. So as in inevitable abortion, the patient might present in shock with heavy bleeding in incomplete abortion. So these are two clinical scenarios where the patient can come. Remember, here the size of the uterus is always smaller than the gestational age what the patient tells, because incomplete in the sense some of the products have expelled and some remaining in the uterine cavity. So the uterine size will always be smaller than the gestational age. Then what about the os will be open here, because there are still products of conception within the uterine cavity, and to expel them the os will be open. So in complete abortion, remember, the os is always open, and on ultrasonography we can pick up the presence of the retained products of conception. So another that is complete abortion is where the patient gives a history of 1.5 2 months amenorrhea followed by heavy bleeding for 2-3 days, and then the bleeding has stopped completely for about no bleeding for about 2-3 days or even a week's time. So that shows that the abortion has completed. When the bleeding has stopped, it shows that the abortion is complete. So here always the uterus will be smaller, because all the products being expelled, the uterus size will reduce automatically. So the uterine size is smaller. Important thing here is the os is closed. So when the bleeding stops, the uterus being smaller than the size of the gestational age, and the os closed, these indicate that there is a complete abortion, no more retained products, and that's why the os is closed. And when you check on the ultrasonography, the cavity has to be empty. There has to be no products inside. So this is complete abortion. Now, what about in missed abortion? How the patient presents to you is either she comes with no symptoms at all. Okay, it's just a incidental finding on ultrasonography. Sometimes we pick up these missed abortions. So she might not have any symptoms at all. Sometimes, or most of the times, the patient will have a spotting only per vaginally, and most of the times it is not fresh red colored. It is usually brownish blood stained discharge what the patients complain of. So this is typical of missed abortion. Here the uterine size will be smaller, because in missed abortion what happens is the fetus ceases to grow, the cardiac activity stops, and once it stops, all the hormonal changes which are necessary for the growth of the baby or the placental tissue also are kind of they stop releasing. So that's why the fetus doesn't grow nor the placental tissue grows. So that's why the uterus is smaller than the size of the gestational age. The os is closed here. So you should remember that the fetus is dead inside, but still the process of abortion has not begun. The dead fetus is retained inside the uterus without showing any signs of the onset of abortion. So that's why the os is closed here. And on ultrasonography, the fetus is dead, in the sense the cardiac activity is absent. So these are the features of different kinds of clinical types of abortion on clinical scenario as well as on the ultrasonography. These are the uh, findings what you can see and diagnose. Now, same thing as I described in the scans, I would like to correlate, make you understand and correlate the things better here. In the first picture, you can see how, in the first picture, you can see here, this is the gestation sac. Okay, and the fetus, the fetal pole is seen here, the embryo you can see here. This is probably the placental tissue developing, and you can see a small area or anechoic area which is there here. Okay, so this particular area here, where there is a membrane and there is a detachment of the chorion, and behind the chorion there is a small anechoic or a black area. So this shows a subchorionic hemorrhage. So subchorionic hemorrhage is very common, and that has to be looked for in any case of threatened abortion. Whenever a patient is coming for threatened abortion, you have to look for the presence of these type of subchorionic hemorrhages. And always remember, even though there is a subchorionic hemorrhage, the fetus will be having a cardiac activity in threatened abortion. Okay, so this is important finding. So most of the times in threatened abortion, we do give a conservative management. We give the patients complete bed rest, abstinence, and also we give a supplement her with progesterones, and even high-end progesterones like injectables also will have to give in such cases. And even HCG injections are given to support the pregnancy and prevent further increase of the chorionic bleed and resolving. So we do take these conservative approaches and ask the patient to completely rest. So the scan is again repeated after 2 weeks or 1 week, and subsequently we need to observe that this particular area of the subchorionic bleed, we usually measure it. Okay, so the radiologist measures and tells us that it's about 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters, and in the subsequent scans it has to reduce in its size. So So that's how it shows a clinical improvement in the threatened abortion. So that is about threatened abortion. Now, in this picture here, you can see it's a picture of retained products of conception actually. So this is the uterus you can see here, and there is some hyperechoic or whitish kind of a tissue, what you can see within the uterine cavity. Okay, so whenever you are suspecting an incomplete abortion, this is how the picture will be: the uterus, the uterine cavity showing some whitish or hyperechoic structures or products inside. So when you put a color Doppler, this is very important. You have to put a color Doppler when you want to diagnose incomplete abortion, when you want to document that the uterus is still having some retained products of conception. It is very important to document by color Doppler. So whenever you put on the color Doppler, it shows increased vascularity. You can see here the blood vessels within this area of retained products of conception. So this is a very important finding. Sometimes we confuse this kind of picture where it could be even a blood clot. So blood clot also will appear as a whitish structure or a hyperechoic structure within the uterine cavity. But when you put the Doppler, the blood clot will not have any increased vascularity, whereas a retained product will have a increased vascularity. So this is how we diagnose that there are still products inside the uterine cavity, and it can be diagnosed as an incomplete abortion. Is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we'll just proceed. Now here in this picture, as you can see, how a complete abortion looks like whenever a patient has given you a history that she's aborted and the bleeding has stopped. When you check on the ultrasound, you should be able to clearly see that there is no more product of conception. Here you can see a proper picture of the uterus, okay, and you can see a nice endometrial lining here. The endometrium appears as a white hyperechoic lining here, and this is the endometrial cavity, which is again a black like lining, small lining. So you can see there is absolutely nothing in the uterine cavity, and what you can see is a normal endometrial thickness here. Okay, so this shows that there is absolutely no retained product of conception. You can compare this picture with the early picture. Here you can see you cannot make out the endometrial lining at all. There is some irregular hyperechoic thing within the endometrial cavity, whereas here you can nicely see a thin endometrial line, and the cavity, small cavity area can be seen, which is empty. So this is a picture of a complete spontaneous abortion, and this one is an incomplete abortion. So you are able to make the differentiation properly now?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. So these are the different clinical types of the abortions. In case of miscarriage, earlier I showed you a picture where this kind of a picture will be there in case of a abortion. You can see the gestational sac, the fetus, the fetal pole is seen, but the cardia will be absent. So this kind of a picture will be there in case of missed abortion. So it's clear to all of you, and then we'll proceed to the another kind of clinical scenario of abortion, that is called a septic abortion. Fortunately, the incidence of septic abortion has come down drastically nowadays because people are more aware. They seek medical help whenever they are looking for any termination of the pregnancies, or they are always enrolled once the pregnancy is diagnosed. The ASHA workers, even in the government setup, the ASHA workers see that they're enrolled, into the government primary health care centers, and they are diagnosed with the pregnancy and any problems, they immediately seek the medical attention, and they don't go for any crude methods of MTPs nowadays. They do seek the doctor's help, and readily available services of MTP has reduced this incidence of septic abortion. But earlier, about 10-20 years back, the septic abortion used to be a dreaded condition where the patient would have come with a lot of complications, and we have seen many cases, patient even losing their lives, ending up in sepsis and more complications like renal failure and septicemia and all that. So septic abortion, you should be having an idea about it, because there might be still cases coming whenever there has been a neglect on the part of the patient or the treating doctors. So when you tell it as there is a septic abortion, whenever the abortion is associated with clinical evidences of infection of the uterus and its contents, then it is called a septic abortion. What are the criteria for septic abortion? It is considered a septic whenever there is a rise in temperature of 100.4 degree Fahrenheit for 24 hours or more, presence of offensive or purulent vaginal discharge, presence of other evidence of pelvic infection such as lower abdominal pain and tenderness. In majority of the cases, the infection occurs following illegal or induced abortion, but may occur following a spontaneous abortion as well. Infection is polymicrobial. That means it is a multi-microbial kind of a picture from the normal flora of the genital tract itself, due to gram-positive, gram-negative, and even anaerobic pathogens. Now, this is important to note, because whenever you want to treat a patient of septic abortion, you have to keep this in mind that it could be a polymicrobial picture, and therefore you have to put an antibiotic spectrum which would cover all these organisms. You need to put up antibiotics which would cover or control gram-positive, gram-negative, and anaerobic pathogens. So that's very important. So we have to use broad-spectrum antibiotics which will cover gram-positive, for example, cephalosporins, and then gram-negative can be controlled by in antibiotics like amikacin and other things, and anaerobic pathogens can be controlled by antibiotics like ornidazole, metronidazole. So we have to put a combination of antibiotics in case of when we are suspecting a septic abortion, because it is a polymicrobial kind of a picture. Now, patients will present with fever, abdominal pain, purulent offensive vaginal discharge, and vomiting in case there is a septicemia, and even shock. Sometimes the patient presents with shock if it is neglected for a longer time. So these are the features of septic abortion. On examination, in case of septic abortion, there will be offensive purulent vaginal discharge, cervix feels soft, the os open, fornices are tender, uterus is tender. And in case of a pelvic abscess which is formed, then you can feel a soft boggy mass in the vaginal fornices can be felt. Because of this pelvic abscess, the patient might even have spiky rises of temperatures, along with associated with mucus diarrhea because of the irritation of the rectum behind. She might present with diarrhea as well. So that is one of the features of presentation in case of a pelvic abscess. So there could also be signs of uterine perforation or bowel injury. So whenever there has been what you call a complicated DNC, where there has been a uterine perforation and it has not been recognized and left alone for a longer period of time, or even post perforation, there could be a bowel injury. Sometimes when there has been a DNC, as I told, by an unskilled person, then there could be even horrible complications like this. That is, the uterine perforation and bowel injury also could be there in septic abortion. Now, what are the complications? There is uterine infection, as we know, endometritis. There is parametritis, peritonitis, septicemia resulting in ARDS, DIC, acute renal failure. What is the sequelae? In case of septic abortion, the patients may result in chronic pelvic pain, and even tubal blockage and infertility are late sequelae of septic abortion. Coming to cervical incompetence. So these all causes what we discussed were mostly related to the first trimester abortions. Now, cervical incompetence, it's the most common cause in the second trimester abortions. So you all understood about septic abortion and the other causes? Shall we go ahead, students?
Yes, ma'am. We understood.
Fine. So now let's go with the cervical incompetence. Now, when do we call it as a cervical incompetence? How do we diagnose? It is characterized by painless cervical dilatation. Remember, it's very important, painless. So painless cervical dilatation in the second or early third trimesters with ballooning of the amniotic sac into the vagina, followed by rupture of the membranes and expulsion of a fetus, usually a live fetus. So all this occurs very suddenly, like in the sense within few minutes. Okay, so this is what the characteristic of cervical incompetence. The patient will give a history whenever she has had a abortion because of cervical incompetence in the previous pregnancy. She'll give a typical history like this, where she had a sudden dilatation, sudden expulsion of the live fetus without even her knowledge, like she didn't even have pain, or sudden rupture of the sac with resulting PROM and sudden expulsion of the fetus. So this is a typical picture or history the patient will give in case of cervical incompetence. So usually the cervical incompetence will result in abortions between 16 to 24 weeks. And with every loss, the gestational age at which the abortion occurs keeps on decreasing, in contrast to syphilis. So here you note that the age at which the abortion occurs it will be decreasing in the sense, if the patient has had first abortion at 24 weeks, then subsequent second abortion she will have in a lesser age itself. That means at 22 weeks only she might abort. So this is how the trend is in case of recurrent abortions in cervical incompetence. So the gestational age at which the abortion occurs because of cervical incompetence goes on decreasing from 24 to 22 to 22 or 18, right? So that is how the trend is. Whereas another condition, that is syphilis, which also causes abortions, here you should note that the trend will be increasing gestational age. For example, if the patient has had an abortion in 10 to 12 weeks, then in subsequent pregnancy she'll abort in a maybe higher gestational age like 14, 16 weeks or 18, 20 weeks. So the trend is upwards in syphilis and downwards in case of cervical incompetence. So that's how you can differentiate between the causes on based on clinical history. Now, what are the causes for cervical incompetence? Mainly it is congenital, developmental weakness of the cervix associated with uterine anomalies like septate uterus, following an in vitro exposure to DES. Acquired causes for cervical incompetence could be due to cervical trauma, like forcible dilatation during previous MTPs or DNC. Conization of the cervix. Conization of the cervix is a procedure which is done in case of what you call pre-cancerous lesions of the cervix, like you have the cervical dysplasias or the carcinoma in situ. Instead of going ahead with hysterectomies, we do have the option of conization of the cervix, where the pre-cancerous lesion is completely scooped off by doing a conization procedure. So the conization also would take off significant cervical tissue, which would result in cervical incompetence. So this is one of the acquired causes for cervix. Cauterization of the cervix. Cauterization of the cervix we do in case of cervical erosion or ectropion. So if there is a significant or a large erosions or ectropions, and there has been a lot of damage or multiple cauterizations have been done on the cervix, also would result in sometimes cervical incompetence. So another acquired cause could be amputation of the cervix, as in Fothergill's operation. There also the cervical incompetence is actually a sequelae of this procedure and cause cervical incompetence. So these are some of the congenital and acquired causes. So how do you diagnose? The typical history, as we described, painless rupture of the membranes followed by quick delivery of a live fetus in the mid-trimester. See, each and every word or, the word here is important to help you diagnose such conditions. It is painless, okay? It's painless. There would be rupture of membranes, quick delivery, and live fetus mid-trimester. So these are the key words you remember if you want to diagnose the cervical incompetence as a cause. Then how do you diagnose in non-pregnant state? The internal loss allows the passage of a number 8 Higgins cervical dilator or Foley's catheter filled with 1 ml water without resistance. A premenstrual hysterocervicography will show the typical funneling of the internal os. And during pregnancy, we can diagnose cervical incompetence by transvaginal ultrasonography, ideally, where we can measure the length of the cervix. And the normal length of the cervix, you all know, is about 35 to 40 mm. If the cervical length is less than 25 mm, and if there is a funneling of the os, and if the os diameter is more than 1 centimeter, these are the USG findings which indicate a cervical incompetence during pregnancy. Whereas in interpregnancy state, the factors which would help us to diagnose a cervical incompetence is usually hysterocervicography or passage of number 8 Higgins dilator without resistance. So these are some of the procedures where we can diagnose. Now, as we said here, when we do an ultrasonography, we will be able to assess the length of the cervix and if there is any funneling of the internal os and the widening of the internal os. So as you can see in this picture here, this is actual the cervix or the whole cervix. This is the internal os, and normally this area here, there is no funneling. There is no funneling here. The cervix actually extends all the way up, and this is how it should normally appear. okay, on the ultrasonography. Whereas in case of a cervical incompetence, there will be funneling at the level of the internal os. And then whatever the cervix is left behind, this is actually the effective cervical length or the functional cervical length which is available, and that is what we have to measure to diagnose whether it is a cervical incompetence or no. And then you can always see the funneling. So they also measure the funnel width and the funnel length. So that's how we calculate the A by A plus B, and then the percent funneling is calculated to diagnose the cervical incompetence. So this is on ultrasonography. So how do you manage whenever there is a case of cervical incompetence? So when there is a history of mid-trimester abortion and you have diagnosed that the patient might have had a previous abortion because of the cervical incompetence, then you do a planned cervical encerclage in the subsequent pregnancies, usually at around 12 to 14 weeks. Okay, so sometimes if it is the first pregnancy in which the patient has come to you with a threatened abortion, and on scan you see that the os is open and the cervical length is small, then you do an emergency prophylactic or it's also called as a rescue plan. So immediately you put up the patient in the OT after evaluation and see that you do an emergency cervical cerclage procedure for that patient. Whereas in case of an elective or a prophylactic procedure, you time it between 12 to 14 weeks when the patient has had a previous abortions or you have diagnosed prior to pregnancy. So why 12 to 14 weeks is important? Because as we discussed earlier, the incidence of abortions because of the congenital abnormalities, it is more common in the first trimester. So to rule out any congenital problems and any abortions occurring because of that, we don't do cervical encerclage before 12 weeks. So once we have passed that risk period of congenital causes for abortions, after about 14 weeks is the time when we plan or schedule the prophylactic cervical encerclage. Okay, so this is what is important. Or another way how the obstetricians time it is like at least 2 weeks before the loss of the pregnancy in the previous pregnancy. So if the patient has had an abortion in like at 16 weeks, previous pregnancy has aborted in 16 weeks of gestation, then we plan to put up the cervical encerclage in this pregnancy at 14 weeks only. Okay, so is it clear to all of you?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
students?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
fine. So sonography should be done prior to cerclage to confirm live fetus and to rule out any abnormalities. That is very important. Now, what are the procedures which are used for cervical encerclage? Most commonly, we use the vaginal methods. So in the vaginal method, the most common what we use is the McDonald's operation. Okay, because it has a good success rate and less blood loss, and it is very easily performed, not much of a skill required, and less complications as well. So that's why and it gives the same results as any other complicated procedure or a vaginal cerclage. So that's why most commonly McDonald's procedure is the one which is used for cervical encerclage. So here you can see in this picture how they do the McDonald's cervical encerclage is, of course, they use all the aseptic precautions, and the cervix is very soft here. Remember, it's a pregnancy, so that's why we use the sponge holders to hold the cervical lips. We usually use 2 of them, one on the anterior and the posterior lip. And the suture what we use here is a non-absorbable one, remember. So it's not an absorbable suture. We use a non-absorbable suture. Usually we use either silk, mersilk, which is called as a mersilk, or we use even Prolene. Earlier we used to use Prolene, but since we have to tie the Prolene knot a lot of times, 7 to 8 times is what the knot memory is for the Prolene suture, and that knot itself is so big that it will start irritating the patient in the vagina or in the fornix. So that's why nowadays we are using Mersilk preferably for this particular procedure. So what they do here is they hold the cervical lips together, and with the help of the needle holder, you can see here they submucosally they pass it. They take multiple stitches along the cervix, around the cervix rather. So you can see here once bite, they take it from outside inside, and then it is inside out. So remember, the cervix is here, the mucosa is here. We do not enter into the cervical canal. We just do it submucosally. We have to take the bite submucosally. So that is what is very important to remember. The thickness of the bites is very important. We have to take submucosal bites. So you take these bites, we kind of take inside out and around the cervix, one on the anterior side, on the lateral side, then posteriorly, then on the other side, and then tie the knot. Here in this picture, they've shown the knot to be tying anteriorly, but we prefer tying the knot posteriorly, because if you tie the knot anteriorly, what happens is the bladder being on the anterior side, sometimes the patient will complain of irritation to the bladder and subsequent frequency of urination and all that. So to prevent that, we usually prefer to take bites from posteriorly. We take the bites from posterior, then on the lateral, anterior, then again on the other lateral, come back down and then tie the knot here, rather than tying the knot anteriorly. So this is about the McDonald's procedure. It's very simple, and just very simple expertise is also important. Another important thing what you have to remember is if at all there is a herniation of the membranes, what you can see, one of the assistants has to push it with a little finger of your hand, and not any other finger which is having a more width. So the assistant pushes in the cervical canal with the help of the little finger those membranes, and hold it until the stitch is put in place and tied, and then you slowly remove your little finger. So you have to push it, if at all there is any herniation of the membrane, slowly, and tie it off. So this is about McDonald's procedure. Is it clear to all of you students?
Yes, ma'am.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Any questions on this, or any doubts in this? Always we have to what you call we have to provide her tocolysis during this period. So we always start with a Duodelan injection intraoperatively, continue it postoperatively, so that if any irritation to the uterus, we should prevent the contractions. That is a protocol. And the complications of this procedure could be injury to the cervical canal, injury or rupture of the membranes if they're very close. Sometimes post operation the patient might develop infection and even bleeding. So these are some of the complications of this procedure. So is it clear to all of you? So it's also called as non-observable purse string suture. Purse string in the sense you just take the bites as you stitch a purse, the mouth of the purse. Okay, so that's why it is also called as purse string suture. So another operation which is done as a cervical cerclage is a Shirodkar's operation. So Shirodkar's operation is also done vaginally, but it is a more technically advanced procedure, and it requires a lot of skill to develop these things. And other option of cervical cerclage is abdominal. So there are three things. One is McDonald's and Shirodkar's, which are done vaginally, and abdominal cerclage. So what are the indications for these advanced procedures, like abdominal cerclage? You, in each and every case, you don't go for a abdominal cerclage because it requires a lot of it has to be done under anesthesia. You have to go intraperitoneal. It requires again a proper setup with OT procedure and all that, and it requires a lot of skill to do an abdominal cerclage. So only in certain conditions would we prefer to go for abdominal cerclage, but in most of the times we end up doing the McDonald stitch only. So in women with incompetent cervix due to severe trauma to cervix, such as deep lacerations, extensive conization, or repeated LEP for the treatment of carcinoma in situ, that is loop excision procedures. So in such cases, we prefer going directly with the abdominal cerclage. And also when there is a history of repetitive second trimester loss or failed vaginal cerclages in women with second trimester losses and anatomic impossibility to place a vaginal cerclage, these are the conditions where we prefer to go for an abdominal cerclage. And when do we remove the stitch? In case of any kind of cerclages, usually it is removed at 37 weeks, or if the patient ends up in preterm labor, once we diagnose that the patient is in labor, even in 34, 36 weeks, we have to immediately remove the stitches by cutting it open so that it doesn't end up traumatic to the cervix. So ideally, we remove at around 37 weeks of gestation. So this is a picture showing the Shirodka's procedure here. In McDonald's, what you saw is they just take the stitches around the cervix and tie it off, right? In this, what they do is they actually cut open the cervical mucosa. So once we hold the cervix, we cut open the anterior side and also the posterior side. Okay, you can see here at the end they put the stitches back. So we cut open the cervical mucus anteriorly, posteriorly. You must have seen this kind of procedure being done in vaginal hysterectomy. Have you all seen any cases of vaginal hysterectomy? In case of prolapse uterus?
Yes, ma'am.
So when you have seen in the vaginal hysterectomy, you must have seen that we take a circular incision around the cervix, is it not? To get access to the anterior peritoneum and posterior peritoneum, right? So similarly here also they take an incision on the cervical mucus, but remember it's only a small nick anteriorly and then a small nick posteriorly. So what they do is they separate the cervical mucus and take the bites of, with the help of these, they take the bite of the needle submucosally, like they go inside and take the bites so that it is more secure. Okay, and here you can observe they use this Mercilin tape kind of a suture, not the normal sutures. They use this Mercilin tape, which is having a bit of a width as well. So it is more secure and holder. So that's why they use this Mercilin tape. So here they cut open the mucosa, take a bite inside, go submucosally on the lateral side, and then take a bite posteriorly also, and submucosally again on this side and tie it off. After they have tied or put up this Mercilin tape, then they close back the mucosal folds of the cervix anteriorly and posteriorly. So this is Shirotka's procedure. Here earlier, as you can read here, original thing was to tie the stitch and do a cesarean section, but nowadays modified Shirotka's is where they tie this, but they do remove the stitch at the time of the delivery, not necessarily section being done each time. So success rates with Shirotka's procedure, they say it's about 80%. So this is the Shirotka's procedure or Shirotka's cervical encerclage. Clear to all of you? No doubt? Yes, students? Have you
Yes.
understood the difference between McDonald's and Shirotka's?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so fine. So we'll proceed. Now, abdominal. These are some of the laparoscopic pictures. So most of the times nowadays, whenever you prefer to do an abdominal cerclage, cervical cerclage, you prefer to do laparoscopically because it is more, quicker and the patient gets better the next day itself. But of course, you need a setup for that, and a good skilled laparoscopic surgeon is needed. In these pictures, what you can see here is in the first picture, they have cut open the UV fold. Okay, so this is actually the uterus here, and this is the UV fold which they have cut open with the help of the cautery, and you can then see the cervix here. Okay, can you all appreciate? Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Students? So what they do is they cut open the UV fold and retract the bladder, and then they identify the cervix, and you can see the arrow placed here. The stitch is taken here anteriorly and taken posteriorly. The needle passed from anterior to posterior side. Okay, so posteriorly you can see here these two cutters. This is the POD and these are the uterosacral ligaments. Can you see the uterosacral ligaments and the POD? So posteriorly the needle is passed from the anterior side, taken out posteriorly, and then they go around the cervix and bring out from the other side. They bring out from the other side like this, from posterior to anterior, and as you can see here, they tie it in the front or even behind. Here what they've done is they have tied it behind in the POD. Okay, so that it doesn't irritate the bladder again. And what the material they've used here is again a muslin tape is what they've used with a good width that will give a better support to the stitches. So that's how they have done. They've taken one bite anterior to posterior and second also anterior to posterior and tied the knot posteriorly. This is the POD what you can see, and the stitch sits nicely around the cervix. Subsequently, they will close the UV fold. As we close in the cesarean section, many of you must have seen cesarean section where the UV fold is open to deliver the baby to get access into the lower uterine segment. And at the end, after we close the uterus, we close the UV fold also. So that's how this is the abdominal cerclage, which is used in very tough cases or unsuccessful vaginal attempts in subsequent pregnancies. We go with abdominal procedure. This is very, very reassuring, and the success rate for abdominal procedure is much higher, but only thing it is more challenging to do. So it's all clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
So what are the contraindications for cervical procedure? Any intrauterine infection, ruptured membranes, vaginal bleeding, severe uterine irritability, cervical dilatation of more than 4 centimeters. Complications, as I discussed, could be chorioamnionitis, rupture of the membranes, preterm labor, necrosis of the cervix, or even rupture uterus sometimes, or very rarely. So these are the complications of the procedure. Next, coming to antiphospholipid antibody syndrome as a cause of abortion. Remember, it is an autoimmune disorder. Okay, it's an autoimmune disorder where there will be autoimmune antibodies will be formed against the phospholipids present in the cell membranes or the cell structure. Right, so it is again a treatable condition. If we identify it pre-pregnancy, it is very much a treatable condition, and it is associated with recurrent second trimester abortions or second trimester pregnancy losses is more common with this particular syndrome. So whenever a patient is presenting to you with recurrent second trimester abortions, it is always important to rule out the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome by getting these antibodies tested. So it is about 15% of the cases of recurrent abortions because of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, and the patient has acquired antibodies targeted against a phospholipid B2 glycoprotein. They can be IgG, IgM, or even IgA isotopes. So most common antibodies for which are there in this kind of a problem is lupus anticoagulants, anti-cardiolipin antibodies, and anti-beta-2 glycoprotein antibodies. So lupus anticoagulant was named so because it was first found in patients with SLE, and it prolonged the partial thromboplastin time. But the name is a misnomer, as though it increases the PTT, that is similar to anticoagulant, but functions are as a procoagulant and causes thrombosis actually. It is not a as we have mentioned here, it is a misnomer. It's not an anticoagulant. It is actually a procoagulant antibody which results in thrombosis in different vessels throughout your body, and the thrombosis is actually the cause for miscarriages in such patients. Okay. Then we have the anti-cardiolipin antibody. It is most commonly seen in patients with repetitive early pregnancy loss. And anti-beta-2 glycoprotein antibodies, which causes the biologically false positive syphilis also. So these are the three important kind of antibodies which are present in such patients. So what is the pathology or the pathogenesis in case of antiphospholipid antibodies syndrome is it causes placental thrombosis. It will go and react with the placental tissue, resulting in thrombosis in the placental blood vessels. That results in decrease in the blood supply to the fetus, resulting in PIH as well, IUGR, and fetal loss. And subsequently, because of the placental thrombosis, the placental functioning is affected, and most of the times it results in maldevelopment of the placenta and a smaller size of the placenta. So this is the pathology in case of antiphospholipid antibodies. How the clinical picture the patients present is usually she comes with a history of recurrent abortions. Only then when you evaluate would you realize that it's because of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Or prior to pregnancies, if the patient is giving you a history of any vascular thrombosis or recurrent arterial or venous thrombosis in any tissue, it could be a small cerebrovascular accident or a DVT. If the patient is giving you that history, then it is always important to get these antibodies tested. But most of the times we suspect antiphospholipid antibody syndrome with the patient giving a history of recurrent abortions, and then when we evaluate, we'll be able to diagnose it. So the patient could present with recurrent spontaneous abortions, even recurrent PIH, up till preeclampsia and eclampsia. Placental insufficiency or abruption also are very common. So the patient presenting with recurrent, IUGR or abruption is also indicative of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So chorea gravidarum, postpartum complications like pulmonary infiltrates, fever, and cardiac symptoms are some of the pregnancy complications. So here in the thrombosis, if at all it is occurring in these patients, remember it is more commonly venous thrombosis rather than an arterial thrombosis. So in the venous thrombosis, as you all know, most common is the deep vein thrombosis that is mainly affecting the lower limbs, right? So that could result in pulmonary embolism, pulmonary hypertension from thromboembolic diseases. So this is the more common events occurring in such patients, the venous thrombosis resulting in DVT, pulmonary embolism, and pulmonary hypertension. So these are the pathogenesis or clinical presentations, correlations of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Other things what it causes is when there is an occlusion in the cerebral vessels, it results in stroke, TIA, even MI in case of coronary occlusion, pulmonary hypertension because of pulmonary blood vessels occlusions. Kidney it can affect, resulting glomerulothrombosis because of renal arterial occlusions, and bones also it affects if it results in avascular necrosis. So these are the systemic effects which are found in antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, which is mainly a thrombotic procedure, and because of the occlusions of the various blood vessels, it will affect the different systems of the body. So is it clear to all of you about the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. So we'll proceed. Now, how do you diagnose this particular condition? There are criteria which have been formed by the different bodies. We call it as the revised Sapporo criteria. Okay. So in these criteria, we have the clinical criteria and the lab criteria for the diagnosis of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. The clinical criteria include vascular thrombosis, which could be in any part of the body, one or more clinical episodes of arterial, venous, or small vessel thrombosis in any tissue or organ. What we discussed earlier, it could be in the brain, in the kidneys, in the bones, even in the lungs. So in any of the tissue or organ, if there is a clinical evidence of vascular thrombosis, is one of the criteria. And if there is a pregnancy morbidity, so previous pregnancies, if there has been a morbidity in the form of one or more unexplained deaths of morphologically normal fetus at or beyond 10th week of gestation with normal fetal morphology documented by ultrasound, one or more premature births of a morphologically normal neonate before the 34th week of gestation because of eclampsia or severe preeclampsia defined according to standard definition, or recognized features of placental insufficiency. Then placental insufficiency can be diagnosed in the form of small placenta, Doppler changes, as in, we do the Doppler assessment of the fetus by umbilical artery and middle cerebral artery, and all those showing placental insufficiency is also one of the features for antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And the third thing is 3 or more unexplained consecutive spontaneous abortions before 10th week of gestation with the maternal anatomic or hormonal abnormalities and paternal and maternal causes excluded. So whenever there is an evaluation for recurrent abortions, and if you have ruled out any of the maternal anatomical problems like we discussed, like septate uterus or uterine abnormalities or cervical incompetence, we also have to rule out any hormonal problems like hypothyroidism, diabetes mellitus, or PCOS, and of course the genetic karyotyping being done in both the parents. And if all these factors are ruled out, and then you have to evaluate for the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome as a possible cause for her repetitive abortions. So these are some of the clinical criteria for diagnosis of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. Now, what are the laboratory criteria? We do the testing for lupus anticoagulants. So lupus anticoagulant present in on 2 or more occasions at least 12 weeks apart, detected according to the guidelines of the International Society on Thrombosis and Hemostasis. This is anti-cardiolipin antibody of IgG and or IgM isotype in serum or plasma present in medium or high titer. An anti-beta-2 glycoprotein 1 antibody of IgG and or IgM isotype in serum or plasma. So basically we need to get these antibodies tested, and the presence of them within the plasma, of course, repeat after 12 weeks should be present, and that will give us a lab criteria for diagnosis of antiphospholipid antibodies. So one is the lupus anticoagulant, anti-lipin antibodies, and anti-beta-2 glycoprotein 1 antibody. These are the three important antibodies testing done. So lab diagnosis could be general diagnosis. We can make hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, or even elevated anti-beta-2 glycoprotein antibody. Specific diagnosis, as we discussed, we need to document the presence of lupus anticoagulant. We can do the kaolin clotting time or the Russell Viper genome testing. And normally we do the PT, INR, and APTT here, which is commonly available. And if it is prolonged, then it suggests, it supports the diagnostic criteria with the presence of the antibodies. And of course, as we discussed, anti-cardiolipin antibodies should be present. How do you manage this antiphospholipid antibody syndrome? This is very, very important. You all should remember that antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, once diagnosed, is treatable. If you give a proper treatment to the patient, we can prevent the subsequent abortions or even complications like preeclampsia, eclampsia, and IUGR, what we discussed because of the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, can all be prevented in these patients. So what is the management is, once we diagnose that the patient is having an antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, we start with a low dose aspirin. That is about 75 milligrams or 80 milligrams of aspirin daily has to be started. And once the we start the patient with low molecular weight heparin. So it is a prophylactic dose. What we start, that is enoxaparin. Normally it is about 40 milligrams a day is what the standard dose we start with the enoxaparin or the low molecular weight heparin. Now this aspirin can be initiated preconceptionally itself. Once the patient is diagnosed with antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, we put her off on aspirin even though the pregnancy is not there. And once the pregnancy occurs, we need to continue with the same dose up till 36 weeks of gestation. Sometimes we have to alter or increase the dose of aspirin. For example, if the patient is on 75 or 80 milligram low dose aspirin, but she has developed a complication in between, like either oligohydramnios, or there are Doppler changes, or there is IUGR, then we soon as the pregnancy is confirmed, it is continued up to term. Up till even 5 days postpartum, we continue the low molecular weight heparin. And women with previous history of thrombosis will usually be already on a maintenance therapy with warfarin. This is important again. You remember that whenever there is a patient with a history of thrombosis, like DVT and arterial thrombosis, what we discussed, she would be put on a maintenance therapy with warfarin. So whenever there is a patient with warfarin, remember preconceptionally, it is very important to stop this warfarin if the patient is planning to conceive, or in the near future she's planning to conceive. Stop the warfarin, switch her on to low molecular weight heparin, and then she can plan for the pregnancy. Because as you all know, why we need to stop warfarin? Yes, anybody?
Bleeding
Pregnancy is a
postpartum
hypercoagulability.
hemorrhage.
No, that is not the reason why we stop warfarin. What is the most important complication with warfarin? Why do you want to switch over? Not only in case of antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, any patient who is having a thrombotic episode previously, and if she's on warfarin, what is the advice you give to her? If she's in the reproductive age and if she's planning for pregnancy, what is the effect of the warfarin? A very major effect.
bleeding, ma'am.
Yes, students. Warfarin is a teratogenic drug. Okay. Remember, it's teratogenic in the sense it will cause fetal anomalies. Okay. So warfarin is a teratogenic drug. It causes fetal anomalies. That's why we should not be giving warfarin periconceptionally. We should stop whoever is on warfarin planning for pregnancy, switch her to low molecular weight heparin periconceptionally. Once she is delivered post pregnancy, then again you can stop low molecular weight heparin and switch her on to warfarin if she needs the anticoagulation therapy. Okay. Remember, warfarin is teratogenic. Okay, it causes fetal anomalies. Now it's a homework for all of you. Find out what are the kind of abnormalities of the fetal abnormalities which are caused because of the warfarin drug. And you all are there in the WhatsApp group?
Yes, ma'am.
So I want at least a few of you to come back with the answer as to what kind of fetal abnormalities are caused by warfarin. Okay? This is a homework for you all.
Yes, ma'am.
So as I said, this slide again tells us that we need to give thromboprophylaxis to the patient in the form of aspirin, low molecular weight heparin, and warfarin if the patient is on. We have to take precautions. So students, I think I'll stop the class here. In the subsequent classes, we can cover up the next part of abortion, that is the medical termination of pregnancy. We're already past the time, that is 8:30. I hope you all have understood clearly about abortion, different causes of abortion, and I just discussed what are the main causes of abortion, and the clinical diagnosis of what kind of abortion it is also very important, and correlating it with the ultrasound findings is also very important. So I hope you all have understood all these points clearly.
Yes, ma'am.
So is there any doubt with anybody? Is there anybody who wants to ask anything or discuss? Yes, students? So how did you find it useful? How the class was? Was it useful?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. So as I told, we'll end up the class here. We have covered the most important points related to the abortion, and in the subsequent classes, in the next class, I will discuss about the medical termination of pregnancy, the indications, what are the rules according to the MTP Act, as well as what are the procedures followed, and then we will take up the MCQs related to these two topics. Okay.
Okay,
So if nobody has any doubts, we will call it a day, and see you all in the next class as well. I hope this class was useful to all of you and you clearly understood all the concepts related to abortion. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So thank you all and have a good evening and good night.
Thank you, ma'am. Good night.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Night.